So you've heard of the popular Raiden teams. We got Raiden National, we got Raiden Hyper Carry, and now we got Raiden Hyper Bloom. But there's this one Raiden team that seems to have been forgotten. I'm talking about Raiden Sunfire. It consists of Raiden, Xingqiu, Bennett, and Jean of all people. And if you've never heard of this team before, I'm not even surprised. It's not that widely used. It's not even one of the strongest teams out there, but it is fun in my opinion, so I want to talk about it. And who knows, you might even want to try it out after hearing about it. Let's go over the team's strengths and weaknesses first. For pros, the most obvious one is, well, you got 2 healers, so you don't need to worry about survivability at all. Chances are you will never die pretty much. Alright, 2 healers, cool. But won't that sacrifice damage? Well, that's my next point. This team has a high damage floor, I'll explain later. But in this team, you don't need to use Xiangling. I consider this a plus because Xiangling is just dies of cringe, man. National teams are cringe. But like national teams, this team has good damage in both single target and AoE. Plus, you get rainbow numbers, which look nice. Onto the cons. First of all, the most obvious one is this team requires 2 5-stars, which not everyone has access to. While this team has good damage, it has a relatively low damage ceiling. Plus, it's heavily burst reliant, which means every single member of the team has to use their burst every single rotation or everything falls apart. And while this team has good AoE damage, it's bad against light enemies because of its lack of grouping, and you tend to knock the enemies away. Also, in this team, you need to deploy 2 different circles in the same place, and you need to stay in those 2 circles until they're gone. So this team has a lot of moving parts, so I will explain each part one by one. The centerpiece of this team is the way Bennett and Jean's burst interact with each other. Bennett's burst applies a constant pyro aura to your active character, while Jean's burst applies Anemo to your active character once per second. This creates a pyro swirl every second that deals pyro damage to enemies around your active character, and this pyro swirl damage scales off of Jean's elemental mastery. Next part is Xingqiu's burst. Just like most other teams, Xingqiu's burst is here to apply Hydro. Keeping a Hydro aura on the enemy allows Jean's Pyro Swirl to trigger Vaporize, and high EM further increases the Vaporize damage triggered by the Pyro Swirl, which already deals damage based on EM. So having high EM not only increases the Pyro Swirl damage, but when the Swirl triggers Vaporize, it further increases the multiplier, which amplifies the Pyro Swirl damage. And that's a lot of damage! And then we have Raiden's burst, which charges energy for the whole team and applies Electro to trigger Electro Charge. And Electro Charge allows both Hydro and Electro auras to coexist on the same enemy. And since swirling has a very strong elemental application, Pyro Swirl actually has enough pyro gauges to trigger both Overloaded and Vaporize at the same time. And guess what Overloaded damage scales off of? EM! So EM is that you want to invest in for your Jean. Just go full EM on artifact main stats, no crits required. And since you don't have to worry that much about artifact substat rolls, this build has a high damage floor and good resin efficiency, but it has a low damage ceiling because it leaves very little room for min-maxing. You don't need to worry too much about getting very high EM because transformative reactions have very bad diminishing returns, so you can leave some room to invest into ER. Because Jean needs to be able to use her burst every single rotation, so you want to hit the ER requirement first, and then invest the rest into EM. In this team, she would typically need around 150% ER if you can squeeze in 2 uses of her skill in between bursts. But it will be higher or lower depending on the situation, so take it with a grain of salt. I recommend Favonia's Sword because it easily hits the ER requirement, allowing you to invest fully into EM in your artifacts, plus the extra particles. Also, it looks nice on her. Also, I recommend the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer set for the 40% elemental resistance shred, which can significantly increase the team's damage if you can swirl Electro, Hydro, and Pyro during Jean's field time. Keep in mind that Jean's burst only applies Anemo to your active character and not the enemies unless they touch the edge of the Dandelion field. So most of the time, Jean's burst can only swirl Pyro, and you won't be able to swirl Electro and Hydro auras between enemies. But you may be able to swirl Hydro and Electro with the initial burst cast or with her skill. Also, after casting Jean's burst, you might want to stay on Jean for around half to 1 second to trigger 1 Pyro swirl before switching out, to trigger the VV debuff because it doesn't trigger when Jean is off field. You might be wondering if Yelan can be used in place of Xingqiu, but Yelan applies less Hydro than Xingqiu. And since Xingqiu applies just enough Hydro to make this work, Yelan won't have enough Hydro applications to be used in place of him. And here's why you specifically need Jean for this team, and it won't work with any other Anemo character like Kazuha. Kazuha's burst applies the element once every 2 seconds, so that's already slower than Jean. Pyro absorption isn't the same as Pyro swirl. The pyro damage in Kazuha's burst is considered a part of his elemental burst, and it scales off attack, crit, and damage percent, not EM. Jean's burst applies Anemo to the active character standing in Bennett's burst, and that character serves as the source of Pyro Aura for Pyro Swirl. Kazuha's burst doesn't do the same. After absorbing Pyro, that's just considered regular Pyro damage. I won't go over the builds of these other characters because they use the same builds that they usually do in other teams, so chances are you already know how to build them because a lot of content creators have covered them already. So all that's left to do now is the showcase.
Everybody stand! Win! Wind, hear me. Now you shall perish. Witness the power of Kazuha. Rain outlines your fate. I'm going in! I swear by my sword! Shine down! Rain outlines your fate. Know my sword! Let's light it up! Everybody stand! Go and fly! Wind, hear me! Inazuma shines eternal! Ha! Ha! Illusion shattered! Rain outlines your face. Let's light it up! Barbados, guide us. Torn to oblivion! Target practice. Let me weave you a verse. Know my sword! Crash our waves and raise us arm! Teamwork is trick! Wind, hear me! Where do you think you're going? Goodbye. There is no rain outlines your face. Going in! I swear by my sword! Inazuma shines eternal! Shine down! Rain cutter, know my sword! Let's light it up, everybody! Go and fly! Wind, hear me! Torn to oblivion! Illusion shattered! Witness the power of Kazuha! Rain outlines your face. Teamwork is trick! Barbados, guide us.
And that's pretty much it. Yeah, this is a bit of a shorter guide, because if you already know how to build these other characters, making and playing this team is pretty straightforward. If I missed anything though, feel free to let me know in the comments below. So yeah, try out this team if you want, let me know what you think, and if you like this video, consider subscribing. I also sometimes stream on Twitch, so you can follow me there as well. And thanks for watching.